talking about the NCAA tournament and looking around at some of the brackets. I asked you guys, what do your brackets look like? Last week, we went through the first 2 rounds, the opening round, as well as round 2, the round of 32. Now we're down to Sweet 16, and today and tomorrow we'll have the Elite 8. Let's start in the South, right, in that bracket. Sweet 16, Auburn, number 1 seed Auburn taking on number 5 Michigan. And then it was Ole Miss who found themselves all the way in the Sweet 16 against Michigan State. Now, I told you guys before, Tom Izzo and Michigan State have snuck by me this year. They were the 2 seed. They are the 2 seed. And Ole Miss was the team watching from the SEC tournament. They got past Arkansas, knocking down a 3-pointer as time expired. And then they took Auburn down to the wire in the semifinal game before getting eliminated in the SEC tournament. Now you look at the NCAA tournament. Ole Miss comes in and knocks down number 11 North Carolina. This is where the bracket got wacky for me because I had Iowa State to move on, the 3 seed, but Ole Miss beats Iowa State handily, 91-78. And then Ole Miss found themselves in a Sweet 16 matchup against Michigan State. Michigan State got it done by 373-70 over Ole Miss, and Auburn gets it done over number 5 seed Michigan, who was really tough, 78-65. So out of the South, now we have an Elite 8 matchup between number 1 seed Auburn and number 2 seed Michigan State. Now, this is where my Elite 8 kind of went bad because I had Iowa State getting all the way to the Elite 8. I thought Iowa State was a pretty good basketball team this year. I thought them as a 3 seed had a possibility of getting as far. They did not. They let me down early on. Early on. We're talking about in the round of 32 let me down. But in the Elite 8, number 1 Auburn taking on number 2 Michigan State in the South region. I'm going number 1 Auburn in that one. I think the number 1 seed Auburn team, especially if you watch them this year, I had a chance to go see them at a game against LSU this year. They have the length. They are very efficient at scoring, and guess what? They play defense. And in this day and age, you got to have a team that plays defense. Let's look in the West, right? My Sweet 16, 2 teams didn't make it in, but one of them I was happy they at least made it to the Sweet 16. Let's start with number 1 Florida, who made it to the Sweet 16. They took on number 4 Maryland. Now, I had Memphis getting to the Sweet 16. Memphis was not as good as I thought they were. I tried to put faith in Memphis. Memphis gets knocked out in the opening round against number 12 Colorado State, 78-70, as Memphis came into the NCAA tournament as the 5th seed. Maryland found themselves in the Sweet 16 taking on number 1 Florida. Maryland, of course, the 4th seed coming out of the West. And then the other game in the Sweet 16, number 3 seed Texas Tech taking on, Arkansas Razorbacks, who was the highest seed, left the Razorbacks the 10th seed, who had knocked off St. John and Kansas to get this far. Let's start with number 1 Florida to get the victory over number 4 Maryland, 87-71. Florida handled business. It's another team representing the SEC who went in, took care of business, and moved on. And then Texas Tech and Arkansas. Arkansas seemed like they had this game handily, right? They seemed like they had this. It was good to go. As time expires towards the end of the second half, Texas Tech battles back. They knock down a late layup, and they win this game 85-83. And I actually had St. John making it to the Sweet 16. So it was going to be the 2 seed St. John versus number 3 seed Texas Tech for me. And then in the top, it was going to be number 5 seed Memphis taking on Florida. That's where my bracket got messed up right there. But listen, Florida still made it. So now in the Elite 8 coming out of the West, I have Florida, the number 1 seed. They'll be taking on the number 3 seed Texas Tech. Raiders, I'm going Florida in this one. Once again, SEC, I think the Gators get it done. They seem like a team that is very tough to beat. Now let's go to the East. We're looking at some teams that made it to the Sweet 16. Now my East bracket pretty much worked out except for one team. Let's start at the top. The number 1 seed Duke Blue Devils taking on number 4 Arizona Wildcats. Duke broke the scoreboard 100-93 in this ball game. And then at the bottom of that bracket of the Sweet 16, number 2 Alabama, the Crimson Tide, took on number 6 BYU. I had the number 3 Wisconsin Badgers making it that far, but Wisconsin lost to BYU 91-89, and I actually didn't even have BYU making it out the first round. I thought that was one of my upsets when they took on number 11 seed VCU, Virginia Common University. I thought VCU was going to be able to get it done, but BYU got on a hot streak. They beat VCU. They beat number 3 seed Wisconsin. But then it all came to an end against number 2 Alabama. Alabama gets the victory 113-88 over BYU, and that sets up an Elite Eight matchup in which I got right in my bracket, everybody. Number 1 Duke versus number 2 Alabama. This is the first time in my bracket where I actually have both the teams in the Elite Eight, where it worked out. And that's in my East. Now, my South and West, I have one team in each one of those Elite Eight that got in. But the East looked like I got that one right. And then we look at the Midwest. Let's go to the Sweet 16. We had number 1 Houston taking on number 4 Purdue. I got that one right. 62-60, number 1 Houston, the Cougars move on. And then at the bottom of that one of the Sweet 16, number 2 Tennessee, the Volunteers. I had them make it to the Sweet 16, but it was not against Kentucky. I thought Illinois, who was the 6th seed coming into this tournament, was a really good basketball team. I had a chance to watch some games of them in non-conference. Illinois could play some ball, but they fell short in the tournament to Kentucky in the round of 32. 84-75 is the 3 seed Kentucky. Got past them, and then we had an all-SEC matchup in number 2 Tennessee versus number 3 Kentucky. Tennessee gets it done 78-65. And once again, I got the East and the Midwest right when it comes to the Elite Eight. Number 1 Houston taking on number 2 Tennessee. Now you see why I'm in first place in my tournament, in my bracket. Now, things get a little tricky. I hope it works itself out right now. A couple teams got into the Elite Eight that I did not pick, Texas Tech being one. But then I have for my Final Four. Y'all ready for it? Number 1 seed Auburn wins the South. My Final Four, number 1 seed Florida wins the West. Then on the other side, I have number 1 seed Duke wins the East versus number 2 seed Tennessee, who wins the Midwest. I think the SEC ends up with 3 teams in the Final Four. Then I'm looking at, for a national championship, 2 number 1 seeds. I'm looking at Duke versus Auburn. And for me, watching Bruce Pearl and his Auburn team, the way they play defense, they get up the court, they create turnovers, they're efficient shooting. But Duke can do the same thing. I watched them the other night against Arizona and how they took off on Arizona. But I'm going with Auburn to win the national championship. So that is my bracket. That is my March Madness. But no Cinderellas this year. And the thing about the Cinderellas, now you're starting to see the difference of college programs being able to pay these players. When you're starting to talk about guys are already in the transfer portal right now. We talked to Coach Johnson last week. At that moment, there were 200-plus players in the transfer portal. The world of college basketball, I'm not sure moving forward if we'll be able to see those stories that we saw in the past of Cinderella teams making it to the Elite Eight and the Final Four. That just may be a thing of the past. Because now the players are going to take the money, and wherever the money is, it's going to typically lead to the big programs with the big names. And what's interesting enough, a few years ago, talking about the SEC, and this is some of the conversation I like to have in that same sense when we're talking about the SWAC. The SEC 10 years ago was not a basketball league. Nobody gave a damn about SEC basketball 10 years ago. It was the Big 12, and it was the ACC. Those were your 2 conferences. The SEC came together with the commissioner, the athletic directors, boosters, and presidents and said, we have to invest in our basketball programs. We have to go out and we got to get qualified coaches around the board. We got to get the best athletes. And we got to pump money into facilities and everything else when it comes to basketball. And you saw over the course of a decade what happened to that conference. They went out and hired good coaches. They brought in the talent, and they started to pump money into it. And that's why you had so many teams from the SEC this year making it into the NCAA tournament. That's why you heard about the SEC in the top 25 and the amount of teams that they had this year in college basketball. It was the investment that they decided to go in, and now it has paid off in SEC basketball. The same could be said for baseball as well. And I bring that back over to say the same thing with the SWAC. As I get ready to close this hour out, we'll close this segment out. We have to be able to make those type of investments. As a whole, as a conference, we have to make those investments in order to ensure that us as a conference move forward and are better. And I'm going to bring that back full circle a little bit later in the show when I bring up to you and talk about the MEAC, because right now, the MEAC may be in some trouble with the possibility of some schools thinking about leaving. And we'll talk about that as it all comes full circle about investing. How do you take it to the next level?